I have sort of two real questions. One is there anywhere a technically credible, evaluatable account of what they actually intend to do? And I'm quite prepared for the answer to that to be no. And two, I'm assuming that there must be an environmental assessment process of some kind to go through. Can you perhaps give us a bit of an account of that and how ordinary mortals would plug into it, and whether that process would itself be likely to give us the technically credible account of what's actually to be done, or does that all remain up in the sky in La La Land, which I expect it will do?
What the Royal Commission says is that they are identifying and evaluating a concept. So there is some level of technical detail. There is a lot of wriggle room, and there is a lot of, this would be of course subject to further clarification and detailed discussion through blah blah blah. In relation to your question about the environmental assessment process, what is actually the current situation now, and that's the point I was trying to make in relation to bipartisan support, is that what's being proposed in South Australia is currently unlawful under both South Australian and federal law. The law, the RPANS Act, the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Act, actually prohibits such a facility. The National Radioactive Waste Management Act, the one which is the enabling legislation for the national approach, prohibits it being used as an international facility. So there would need to be fundamental rule changes, law changes. There would need to be new laws. There would need to be new powers and resources given to RPANSA, the Federal Nuclear Safety Agency. All of this is a vastly unexplored and uncertain area. And if it's necessary to have a long fight to stop a forever waste being in Australia, then that's worth a long fight. But I'd far prefer a shorter, brisker fight where it was just quietly parked as a bad idea and moving right along.
Now, I'm well aware that in South Australia there's a real problem about getting this material out because the media is basically Murdoch owned, is that right? Now, what are your plans for extending the campaign to areas in Sydney, New South Wales, but particularly of Sydney, where we do have some very progressive journalists, senior journalists, on both the Sydney Morning Herald and also on Guardian. But we also need some more material.
And the Saturday paper.
And the Saturday, of course, Saturday, which comes from Melbourne. So I'm not trying to put Melbourne down. But I think we need to get the material to our comrades in the media because if they start writing articles about this, that's going to help enormously. But I think we also, all of us here, need some material that we can actually start to roll now off ourselves and disperse amongst our different progressive organisations. So is there any written material yet about the campaign that can be sent to us and we can then start to reproduce it and start to circulate that amongst progressive groups? It's brilliant material. I think once people read in detail what you're saying, it's going to cause a huge swell of opposition from the big states, which are New South Wales and Victoria.
The addition was a question about where are the Greens. Perhaps if I can deal with that one first, because that one's really easy. South Australian Greens and Australian Greens are both absolutely opposed to the international proposal and have been very, very active. One of the things, look, we're at the early sort of days of this campaign, and I suppose reflecting on it, one of the things that I think has been a little bit of a trap for how we've approached it to date is we've approached very significantly in South Australia. We've approached very significantly with the Royal Commission process, like a 250-page submission, a detailed submission, commentary on terms of reference, all sorts of things like that. So we engaged with the process, and we've engaged, and no apology for engaging with the South Australian community, and particularly Indigenous communities. We've made quite a few regional trips and facilitated meetings and things like that. But as we all know, like, decisions get made largely on the eastern seaboard, national decisions, and this is a national issue. So we need to, as environment groups and other players, actors, stakeholders, whatever, we need to nationalise the issue, get it out of South Australia, because that constraint of the Adelaide Advertiser being pro and not just running dead on every other critique is a real issue there. Social media, Indigenous networks, organisations like Politics in the Pub, or networks, because the reach that you crew have in your address books collectively is huge. So that's really important, and I really welcome that, and we will follow that up. There is some material. We probably need to tailor it a bit, because it's material largely for South Australia, so it's got like the premier as opposed to the bigger picture. And it's also assumes, because South Australians have heard this for a year, whereas most people now on the eastern seaboard are like, first time. Yeah, haven't heard about it. So we need to rejig that a little bit. In relation to the question was also asked about federal Labor. Federal Labor, last year at their national conference in Melbourne in July, there was a push to liberalise their waste policy, so to explore economic opportunities of waste. Fortunately, that was effectively rebuffed, and they reaffirmed their policy of remain strongly opposed to the importation of. And during the federal election campaign, there was a targeted call for federal Labor candidates, particularly in South Australia, about knowing and owning that policy position, which saw federal Labor issue a standard form letter saying that they remain strongly opposed to the importation of international radioactive waste. So that's all positive and needs to be talked up. And that would be one really positive thing, direct thing out of tonight. Those of you who do have contacts within Labor, to just let them know that their existing policy of strong opposition is prudent, positive, sensible, popular, should be retained. They should be proud of it.
My name is Ken Cregan. I'm a conservationist but also an electrical engineer. First of all, thank you for the talk. Very excellent. In order to put things in perspective, since we export a lot of uranium to nuclear power stations all around the world, I was wondering if you could fill us in on what the ratio is between the uranium that we export versus what we're expected to store coming back from the rest of the world in terms of the active material on a per annum basis going forward. And given that it's quite likely that we don't take back all that we export, where else do you propose that this uranium be, after it's gone through its first activation cycle, be stored, given that Australia is geologically stable, has a lot of desert, is rather ideally placed on the planet. So from an overall planet conservation viewpoint, there are good arguments to store this uranium in Australia, especially as we can continue to process it further on. And also taking into account the problem's only going to get worse because we're phasing out petroleum into using electric power for cars, and you can see how we use it lighting, air conditioning. We're going to use more and more, and electrical engineers know we cannot cater for the base load just from the renewables, which are based on cyclical parameters. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. That's very interesting stuff. If I can just pick, there's a lot there to try and answer. I must just say though that I don't share. We don't share the same view in relation to baseload power, and the potential of renewables. Well, we could have. There is a necessary and important discussion there, but I'm not sure if it's the one for tonight. But I'm not trying to squib your question, I'm just trying to deal with the first ones, which were really quite significant ones. You asked about in relation to proportions of return in relation to exports of uranium. Australia has been exporting uranium since 1980, like it was before then with Rum Jungle and that, but the modern period with Ranger since 1981. We've exported around 10,000 tonne a year of U3O8, uranium oxide. Through that period, we're now exporting around 5. Now, I haven't done the ratio that you've needed, and it's an interesting question about how does that look? Because we've, say, 40 years of uranium at 10,000 tonne a year is 400,000 of oxide, and this is proposing to bring in 138 of high-level waste. Now, obviously, yeah, so obviously a smaller amount in volume, a vastly, hugely more amount in radioactive material and content. So orders of magnitude, vast orders of magnitude greater, but that's a brief read of thumb of that. The other one is that there's no question that this is an energy-hungry planet and it's only going to grow. And that, like, how do we move away from fossil fuels? How do we address climate change? How do we move away from nuclear? For us, they are real areas of discussion and challenge. There's no question about it. We see the future, though, strongly as renewables. Renewables now are producing 2 times the amount of world electricity as nuclear is today. The other thing that you raised, a question about exports going out, and then and material coming back. And it's interesting because Australia, as we all know, is a high resource economy. You know, a lot of coal, a lot of iron ore, a lot of minerals. But the only mineral that we hear that there is a moral obligation or an obligation or it should come back here because we sent it out, the only waste stream that we hear that from any mineral is in relation to uranium. So that's an interesting one, and for me it illustrates not so much a moral obligation to deal with waste, but a technical, political and real world complexity of the waste itself. No one's asking us to take back fly ash from coal. No one's asking us to take back scrap iron from iron ore. Right. Massive volumes, bigger than what we sell out in uranium. Right on.
I'm Arthur Chesterfield Evans. I'm a doctor, and I've always been interested in preventive health and preventive social policy. And I'm a green as well. I'm in favour of renewable energy and the beyond zero emissions approach to long-standing renewables. But what I'm interested in is, in terms of future uranium, I've heard that thorium is not as bad in terms of producing waste, but it can't be used because the existing plant would have to be modified. So could you talk about thorium in terms of the long-term use of nuclear fuels? And secondly, I'm interested in the bioavailability of the waste that we take. What is its bioavailability in terms of how much it would pollute? Would it, for example, get into the Great Artesian Basin? And if so, does that water become radioactive and does it spread? I mean, what is the... we're talking 1 million years here. How available will it be in air or being washed around or eroding, or... I mean, is it going to have to be repackaged every 100 years or every 50 years? And what about Synrock? We heard about Synrock a few years ago, which was the solution to nuclear waste. They had this rock thing, they were going to put it in and it was going to go back in the ground from which it came and be no problems. Has anything happened with Synrock? So I guess there's 3 questions there.
Thanks, Arthur. In relation to thorium, a lot of people talk about thorium, and particularly some people are... India often is quite ambitious and excited about thorium. And China is indeed. Look, thorium it's still a radioactive process. You're still left with a radioactive waste. The waste is not as long lived a waste as it is with the standard uranium reactor process. It's still, though, a radioactive waste, and it still is possible. One of the things that is said about thorium, which is not supported, in fact, is that you can't use material from a thorium reactor for any sort of dirty bomb or nuclear device, but it's been shown actually that you can. So from our view on thorium is that it's like a little bit like a further distraction. There's a time when, you know, if you need to retool nuclear reactors to take a new still nuclear fuel, then there's an opportunity there to move away from that time. And our view, ACF's view, is it's time to just draw the line. We don't have nuclear power in Australia. The South Australian Royal Commission, which looked at it, said it doesn't stack up. It's not economically feasible. It didn't rule it out, but it just said it's not feasible. Our view is that the energy future is renewable. So don't go into Generation 4 reactors. Don't go into dreaming about thorium reactors. Don't. Move into embrace a renewable energy future. In relation to the bioavailability, if Commissioner Scarce was here, he'd say, for relax, there is no bioavailability, it'll be fully containerised, it'll be completely inert, it'll be held within a bentonite clay, it'll be this and that, it'll be copper containerised. I honestly don't know what the rate of decay of the proposed containerisation would be. I don't know. So I don't see how any containerisation system can last that long. I don't see how that's possible. The idea of repackaging, if containers lose their integrity, that makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't make a lot of sense in this proposal because this proposal is for deep emplacement. It's emplaced, it's buried, it's concreted in, and then you don't go back. You don't recover, you don't redress. So that wouldn't happen. There would be seepage and leakage. I don't know at what rate or in what direction or any of that because we haven't got a site, there's no modelling. But there would be, increased risk of exposure through transport, shipping, handling, and ultimately through the decay of even the best containerised material. You asked the question about Synrock, synthetic rock developed by Professor Ted Ringwood out here at ANSTO. And look, it showed promise for quite a while. ANSTO has they've got a new Synrock program happening now. They're excited about it, but there's not commercial application, and it seems to have sort of plateaued as a solution, and it's not been picked up and applied by any of the international utility players as a management technique.
You've answered and relieved me greatly because in the early part of your talk, I don't know if you're aware, but you seem to imply that the Greens in South Australia were favourable to the storage. And I thought that was hard to comprehend, but you've put my mind at rest about that. So my question's very simple. Where does Senator Xenophon and his new party line up? Because it seems to me they're quite influential.
Yeah, look, Alice, thanks for clarifying that. Can I get this absolutely straight for the record? If I gave that impression, then that is absolutely not any impression that I wanted to convey. The Australian Greens, led by Scott Ludlam, the national spokesperson on nuclear issues, have been absolutely red hot against this. And the South Australian Greens, led by Mark Parnell, MLC in South Australia, has been a driver in exposing, asking hundreds of questions in Parliament, playing a key role in setting up a parliamentary inquiry, all sorts of checks and balances, and doing as much as they can to highlight this issue. So they have been very clear and very active. So my deep apologies to all if I conveyed otherwise. In relation to Senator Xenophon and the Nick Xenophon team, Senator Xenophon has been very cautious previously about engaging in a lot of these issues. He has increasingly expressed concern and opposition, and in the recent federal election context, both Rebecca Sharkey, the Xenophon now member of the lower house in Mayo, signed a environmental pledge put out by ACF and the South Australian Conservation Council, and in part of that she said that she was very concerned about plans for the national facility, and that she had high level concerns about the international plan, and that then there needs to be much more transparency and a public referendum and much more public input. So you've got a situation where federal Labor are strongly opposed and a clear policy position to that, but perhaps aren't saying as much in the public realm as they need to. You've got a position where state and federal Greens are very opposed and very active, and you've got a position where Xenophon team, the new emerging force in South Australian politics, is increasingly seeing that this is an issue of concern, and they're talking about concerns. They're not coming out now and saying we are absolutely opposed, but they're saying that there needs to be referendums, increased transparency, and that they have deep concerns.
And no rush.
No rush.
Jim McElroy from Green Left Weekly. Thanks very much, Dave, for that very informative talk. Just on the question that Wynne raised about media covering this issue, I do want to give a plug. I have to take the opportunity to give a plug to Green Left Weekly because we've covered it regularly, and in the issue I have here, if anyone hasn't got it, there's a very good article by Renfrey Clark about it. I just want to quote one thing, how wild the economic case is being pushed by the powers that be in South Australia. This is a quote from the Murdoch Advertiser. They declared in February that a gigantic $445 billion would be pumped into the state's finances over the next 70 years. And this is in a state which is probably, maybe with Tasmania, the one that's struggling most. So people are looking at those figures and going, wow, this is going to solve our problems. This is total insanity, because the question that I wanted to ask Dave about is the broader question of the future of the nuclear industry on a world scale. The future of the nuclear industry is in jeopardy. And that's a comment, I'm coming to a question. After Fukushima, there's a real challenge in Japan. Germany is phasing out of nuclear, that's my understanding, of nuclear. Any idea that there's going to be some pot of gold for this industry based on the future of the nuclear industry is quite fantastic. And okay, my question is, there is a related point, which is that nuclear is being presented in some quarters as an answer to climate change, that somehow nuclear is a renewable resource. And I just wonder if you could comment on that, because it's sort of being presented as one of the options for a renewable alternative to fossil fuels. So if you could just comment on that, please, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. And can I really just take the opportunity to acknowledge Green Left and to acknowledge the absolutely pivotal role of that independent, that progressive, that community media has in this country, in actually incubating the stories that are the real struggles, which then percolate and get picked up by more mainstream and more broader media. But it's so important. So thanks for your role in that. Look, the nuclear industry is in serious trouble. There is absolutely no question about it. It's in serious trouble. It used to supply around 20% of the world's electricity. Now it supplies 10. Renewables today are supplying 20. Their roles have renewables are cheaper in many ways. They are more deployable. They're more flexible. There's the base load argument you can get into, but you can also talk about deployability. We look at the thing of services as opposed to output. So people want energy services. They want hot water and cold beer. They don't want megawatts. They want the things that megawatts can deliver. And they want them when they're ready. They don't want it 24/7. They want it when it's there. So it needs to be demand sensitive. Flexibility, responsiveness. That's the language of 21st century electricity and energy. And we see renewables as a pivotal in that. And one example that we see is in communications technology. If you go to Africa, you walk around Africa, you can be in the boondocks in Tanzania, and there will be someone, and they'll have an English Premier League t-shirt on or shirt on, and they'll be on a mobile phone. Yeah, and everyone is talking. The communication need is to communicate and converse, and they're doing it. They're not doing it by poles and wires, and they're doing it they've leapt that generation of technology, and they've embraced the one that is deployable, rapid, meets the need. And we see the same in relation to renewables. So absolutely the industry's in real trouble. As you say, Germany, they're still well on track. Angela Merkel, Conservative, CDU, she said the two challenges for the German leader is to get Germany through the GFC and to exit Germany from the nuclear industry. Incredible. Siemens said, for us, the nuclear chapter is closed. Last week, Diablo Canyon and Friends, Diablo Canyon reactor in California made a deal with Friends of the Earth America. Don't hassle us too hard, we'll close in the early 2020s, no more, over and out. Germany, the 5th largest economy on Earth, getting out of nukes. California, the 6th largest economy on Earth, just in that state, getting out of nukes. That's the way it's trending. Japan, Fukushima, as BHP said, Fukushima changed everything. But also an animal is most dangerous when it's wounded and threatened and backed into a corner. And this animal of the nuclear industry has massive institutional power and will pull every deal that it possibly can. And that's one of the reasons why this South Australian radioactive waste thing is so important, because it is an enabler. If they can clear the decks to say, look, we've got rid of this waste problem, it removes a whole range of regulatory and community blocks in their countries to go further in an industry where otherwise they'd be under increased pressure. It's no, sorry, I know you want to, Joe, but I just want to also think, you said about the climate change. Some people talk about nuclear power as a bridge. We see it as a dead end. Like, we need to we need to transition the economy now from the old heavy industries into light, much more responsive, deployable renewable sector, energy efficiency and smart economics, not heavy centralised economics.
As the gentleman suggested, there was a petition last year where more than 1,000 Australian scientists signed for Australia to consider nuclear power. And so what I'm saying is that this organisation needs to not look at this radioactive waste as a big issue, but I think it's what's behind it they're considering, because they are, as you mentioned, they're also looking at nuclear power, and before they can really push that along, they'll need to have somewhere to dispose of that waste from that nuclear power. So once the nuclear waste solution is resolved, then it will be so easy to push the nuclear power proposal through. And with a lot of highly influential, educated scientists who signed that petition last year, I think that is something you've got to watch out for. The other thing you've got to watch out for is that if you look around the nuclear waste facilities around the world, not necessarily in the USA, but also in Europe, one man's rubbish is another man's treasure. So not only is this Royal Commission trying to promote this as an economic boon of $450 billion in the future, not only is that an incentive, but the other incentive is that the nations that are trying to get rid of their radioactive waste are the ones who can't afford to further process that waste, and therefore they're just going to sort of pay us to take that waste. And the people who are behind this are really considering of how they could process that waste, if not in the next 10 years, probably further down the line, and stick it back into the generation, and fourth generation or fifth generation, if there is such a thing. But third and fourth generation, you can use some nuclear waste to continue to stoke the nuclear power supply. So I think to pose this as a question is, have you got any plans or in your campaigns for considering the waste as some sort of pre-processing fuel for the future, and also considering that it's really a backdoor for nuclear power in Australia?
Thanks TJ. Look, the nuclear power in Australia idea comes up reasonably regularly. Probably many of you will be aware of the UMPNA review, the review that was conducted by Ziggy Switkowski when John Howard was Prime Minister. Yep. That was a review that said we need and we should have 25 reactors by 2050. Now, that was a big push at the time, and a couple of things happened. One is that, again, there was a move to try and move it away from a theoretical abstract discussion, should we countenance nuclear power, into actually how would that look? Where would they be? Where's those 25 sites? And again, the Australia Institute did a report that looked at some basic criteria: access to water for cooling purposes, access to the grid, etc., etc., and picked 25 sites around Australia which might host a reactor. It was an idea. It was a valid enough, but it was an idea starter, conversation starter. Now, that was again in an election context, and it saw people run for cover, and it saw a lot of Liberal politicians say this will not be happening in my electorate, or not in my backyard, not on my watch, all that sort of stuff, and it turned into a problem for the government. And the idea, just the wheels started to unravel. Ron Walker, Hugh Morgan set up a private company to build Australia's first nuclear reactor, either in South Australia or in Victoria. And a year later they delisted it. And Walker said, pushing for nuclear power is a waste of my time. It's been a complete waste of time. So every time it comes up, there's a strong level of community resistance and concern. And there's also an increasing appetite for renewables in Australia. There's 1 million Australian homes with solar on the roof. It's quite remarkable uptake. And then when this came along, when this Royal Commission came along, I thought it would try and open the door to nuclear power. And there was those who are Generation 4 believers who gave that a real crack. And they put very strong arguments, like the Sean Edwards argument, that we can use waste as an asset, as a fuel. And I thought that it would get taken up by this, but fortunately it didn't. They said that it's not commercially viable, it doesn't currently exist, it's interesting engineering, but it's not there. And it just said it's not a credible solution. What it did do, though, is it said there may be changed circumstances in the future. Let's not demonise nuclear effectively. Let's not rule it out of bounds. But it didn't say let's embrace or let's develop it. So that, I think, if even a pro-nuclear Royal Commission strongly pushed says that, I think nuclear power in Australia is really increasingly unlikely. And I just view nuclear waste as nuclear waste. I certainly don't view it as some sort of asset. I view it as a very profound and long-lived threat.
Graham Palis, Dave, thank you for your exposition tonight. I'd like to make a few observations with this in regard to South Australia. South Australia has a performance capability in whatever it touches in the C- category as far as I'm concerned. It's never set the world on fire with its automotive work. The previous submarines were a joke of long standing, and their final one at the moment is the way they ran the Arium steel complex. Only a special group could lose $4 billion on the only steel producing long product line in the country. So now that they've done all that, Mr Turnbull's buttered them up with a set of submarines. And will that keep Mr Weatherall happy for a while, or they're only one step before the nuclear waste, but they are at least buying 15 or 20 years. The other thing about the nuclear in itself, we've got Chernobyl and Fukushima. These are two on-the-surface waste nuclear dumps. They weren't built for that purpose, but that's how they finished up, and they still can't be effectively managed. They're still building containment at Chernobyl after 30 years. Any ideas? Thank you.
In relation to Fukushima and Chernobyl, you're absolutely right. Fukushima, there's been a massive impact, a massive spend, and the IAEA assessment is 40 more years, 4 decades of active management at the site. That's quite major engineering interventions they're having there. It's not just like a few blokes, going around keeping an eye on the perimeter fence. Like these frozen ice walls to stop groundwater movement, massive exercises to relocate spent fuel rods, all sorts of stuff, and 4 decades more of that to try and get the site into a managed perspective. Still a new sarcophagus containment area going on at Chernobyl. It's epic stuff in all the wrong senses of that word. So yes, I think if you're looking for cautionary tales for an industry, there should be enough of them around. You spoke about the economic reality, what that might mean, the submarines for South Australia. The submarines thing opens up so many other questions. I find it extraordinary. I find it, personally, deeply depressing in our country that there's a $50 billion spend on these lethal war machines without a discussion about our defence policy, our defence posture, our relationship with the United States. What are our threats? What do we face? And what is our role as a nation in the world? There's a behind doors deal, and the thing becomes almost a Ludbrook style. Is it going to be the Japanese, the Germans or the French that get the contract? Who do you reckon? And then it becomes who will get the jobs? Will it be South Australia or somewhere else? And there's a $50 billion spend. And that's a spend that could deal with vast amounts of social need in this country. It's a spend that could have totally renewableised our nation's energy. There's so many things you could do with that apart from a specific death machine. So the 50 billion, in the functional realpolitik world, it certainly takes the heat off Weatherall. 2,000 jobs in South Australia. They could crow about that. I don't know. I don't understand and pretend to understand how politicians think. I must say though, you're might be fair, but you're also hard in relation to your assessment. You're like a tough Year 10 English teacher. But they get A's. They get A's in their wine, their food, their country, their art. They do some things really well, the South Australians. So we shouldn't leave tonight. We shouldn't leave tonight thinking, South Australian, bit of a basket case, get what they deserve. I tell you though, there's an aspect here that I haven't raised, which is the opportunity cost of a nuclear dump for those things that South Australia is getting A's in niche food, in clean agricultural production, in fisheries, in horticulture and great wines. And those things, there's not enough of an assessment in this of the impacts, perception and practical of what this industry, if it's the doors open, might mean to other industries that exist and actually do employ people and do sustain communities.
I have a question or two parts regarding the Royal Commission. Firstly, were there any technical solutions or ideas presented in their discussion that they have in the report? And secondly, have they identified who the lobbyists and the people behind who they are regarding them pushing for them to introduce a nuclear dump in South Australia? Now, another thing on the side, being a little bit facetious, my question is, should we, since the nuclear industry is actually struggling now and seems to be in structural decline in future, my question is, should we be raising funds to actually save a few of their CEOs just in case something goes wrong for them in the long run? And also, according to John Howard, what's ever happened to our uranium-powered laptops that we were promised? And where are our 18 radioactive cats with 18 half-lives? But anyway, can you give us an answer? Thanks.
Okay, in relation to the first one, in the technical ideas, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of technical detail about different containerisation techniques, different aspects of how radioactive waste might be managed or is managed. In particular, the two areas that really impressed the Commissioner and the Commission were Sweden and Finland. Sweden's radioactive waste program is not as advanced as it's represented in in the report, but the Finnish one it's quite advanced, and they have with Finnish Riga a deep geological burial place for their waste. It's only for Finnish waste. There's a lot of talk about the sort of properties of the rock, the sort of depth you need, groundwater movement, containerisation. So I'm not trying to say that this is that there's no technical detail, but when it comes to translating that to Australia, it's like the Commissioner again and again and again comes back and says, it is not my role to advance a specific project or site, it's to evaluate a concept. So again, it's the 25 reactors rather than the 25 localities style thing. In relation to identifying lobbyists, that was poorly done, including in relation to the expert panel. Like, for example, one of the expert panel is Dr. Tim Stone, and Dr. Stone's also non-executive director of a group called Horizon Energy, which is a UK-based nuclear power company. All that stuff should be much more transparently declared, and it wasn't. It was squeezed out through the process, and then it was made that those who squeezed it out were somehow offensive to imply that a gentleman of Dr. Stone's stature would in any way. And it's nothing. It's not that. It's not. I'm not sitting up here to have a go at him. I'm having a go at a process that doesn't say front and centre. If I turn up to a thing like that, which they didn't let me, my title is Nuclear Free Campaigner. It's pretty clear. So if we're going to be in a contested territory, doesn't mean bias isn't a bad thing if it's declared and has a rationale. If it's got no basis in any sort of evidence, it's not useful. And if it's not declared, it's not useful. Like, let's be mature enough to have contested ideas, particularly when the stakes are so high. So that was a concern we had. In relation to raising funds, I reckon they can stand on their own 2 feet on their own 2 feet. But there's an interesting thing. I was looking at the other day, just this week, and it's sometimes small things that can illustrate a bigger trend. On Gumtree at the moment, there is an Energy Resources of Australia, the mob who run the Ranger uranium mine in Kakadu, hard hat, a 1996 ERA hard hat, and their asking price is $349 to buy that piece of Australian mining memorabilia and history as this mine limps to its close in a year or two's time. Now, that asking price for one hard hat that was standard issue is $980. You get 980 ERA shares for that. So we've sent a little note to ERA saying, don't throw out the hats. Keep anything that's got a badge on it. And maybe there's more money, like a failing rock band, there's more money in the merchandising than in the mining.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been one hell of a meeting. We started off with some depressing comments about reality and so forth. We were then enlightened, and then at the end we got a lot of hope. And for this we've got to thank our wonderful speaker, that without him this evening wouldn't have happened. So I think you should all put your hands together and thank David very much for convening. Next week our topic is $100,000 degrees.